Canada culture. Canada's culture draws influences from its broad range of constituent nationalities, and policies that promote a just society are constitutionally protected. Canada has placed emphasis on equality and inclusiveness for all its people. Multiculturalism is often cited as one of Canada's significant accomplishments, and a key distinguishing element of Canadian identity. In Quebec, cultural identity is strong, and many commentators speak of a French-Canadian culture that is distinct from English-Canadian culture. However, as a whole, Canada is, in theory, a cultural mosaic, a collection of regional ethnic subcultures. Canada's approach to governance emphasizing multiculturalism, which is based on selective immigration, social integration, and suppression of far-right politics, has wide public support. Government policies such as publicly funded health care, higher taxation to redistribute wealth, the outlawing of capital punishment, strong efforts to eliminate poverty, strict gun control, the legalization of same-sex marriage and cannabis are further social indicators of Canada's political and cultural values. Canadians also identify with the country's foreign aid policies, peacekeeping roles, the national park system and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Historically, Canada has been influenced by British, French, and Indigenous cultures and traditions. Through their language, art and music, Indigenous peoples continue to influence the Canadian identity. During the 20th century, Canadians with African, Caribbean and Asian nationalities have added to the Canadian identity and its culture. Canadian humor is an integral part of the Canadian identity and is reflected in its folklore, literature, music, art, and media. The primary characteristics of Canadian humor are irony, parody, and satire. Many Canadian comedians have achieved international success in the American TV and film industries and are amongst the most recognized in the world. Canada has a well-developed media sector, but its cultural output, particularly in English films, television shows, and magazines, is often overshadowed by imports from the United States. As a result, the preservation of a distinctly Canadian culture is supported by federal government programs, laws, and institutions such as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, the National Film Board of Canada, NFB, and the Canadian Radio Television and Telecommunications Commission, CRTC. Symbols. Canada's national symbols are influenced by natural, historical, and Indigenous sources. The use of the maple leaf as a Canadian symbol dates to the early 18th century. The maple leaf is depicted on Canada's current and previous flags, and on the arms of Canada. The arms of Canada are closely modeled after the Royal Coat of Arms of the United Kingdom, with French and distinctive Canadian elements replacing or added to those derived from the British version. The Great Seal of Canada is a governmental seal used for purposes of state, being set on letters patent, proclamations and commissions, for representatives of the Queen and for the appointment of cabinet ministers, lieutenant governors, senators, and judges. Other prominent symbols include the beaver, Canada Goose, and common loon, the crown, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and more recently the totem pole in Inukshuk. Canadian coins feature many of these symbols: the loon on the $1 coin, the arms of Canada on the 50-cent piece, the beaver on the nickel. The penny, removed from circulation in 2013, featured the maple leaf. The Queen's image appears on $20 banknotes, and on the obverse of all current Canadian coins. Literature. Canadian literature is often divided into French and English language literatures, which are rooted in the literary traditions of France and Britain, respectively. There are four major themes that can be found within historical Canadian literature: nature, frontier life, Canada's position within the world, all three of which tie into the garrison mentality. By the 1990s, Canadian literature was viewed as some of the world's best. Canada's ethnic and cultural diversity are reflected in its literature, with many of its most prominent modern writers focusing on ethnic life. Arguably, the best-known living Canadian writer internationally, especially since the deaths of Robertson Davis and Mordecai Richler, is Margaret Atwood, a prolific novelist, poet, and literary critic. Numerous other Canadian authors have accumulated international literary awards, including Nobel laureate Alice Munro, who has been called the best living writer of short stories in English, and Booker Prize recipient Michael Ondaatje, who is perhaps best known for the novel The English Patient, which was adapted as a film of the same name that won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Visual arts. Canadian visual art has been dominated by figures such as Tom Thomson, the country's most famous painter, and by the Group of Seven. Thomson's career painting Canadian landscapes spanned a decade up to his death in 1917 at age 39. The Group of Seven were painters with a nationalistic and idealistic focus, who first exhibited their distinctive works in May 1920. Though referred to as having 7 members, 5 artists, Lauren Harris, A. Y. Jackson, Arthur Lismer, J. E. H. MacDonald, and Frederick Varley, were responsible for articulating the group's ideas. They were joined briefly by Frank Johnston, and by commercial artist Franklin Carmichael. A. J. Casson became part of the group in 1926. Associated with the group was another prominent Canadian artist, Emily Carr, known for her landscapes and portrayals of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast. Since the 1950s, works of Inuit art have been given as gifts to foreign dignitaries by the Canadian government. Music. The Canadian music industry is the 6th largest in the world, producing internationally renowned composers, musicians and ensembles. Music broadcasting in the country is regulated by the CRTC. The Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences presents Canada's Music Industry Awards, the Juno Awards, which were first awarded in 1970. The Canadian Music Hall of Fame, established in 1976, honors Canadian musicians for their lifetime achievements. Patriotic music in Canada dates back over 200 years as a distinct category from British patriotism, preceding the first legal steps to independence by over 50 years. The earliest, The Bold Canadian, was written in 1812. The National Anthem of Canada, O Canada, was originally commissioned by the Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, the Honourable Théodore Robitaille, for the 1880 Saint Jean-Baptiste Day ceremony, and was officially adopted in 1980. Calixte Lavallée wrote the music, which was a setting of a patriotic poem composed by the poet and judge Sir Adolphe Basile Ridier. The text was originally only in French before it was adapted into English in 1906. Sport.